What if your greatest talent also became the weapon of your destruction? Echo wasn't just a beautiful nymph in a myth. She was a storyteller, a force of nature who could captivate anyone with her words. But the very gods who once needed her gift found a way to rob her of it forever. What did she do so wrong? And how did she end up as nothing more than a faint, fading voice? Let's explore Echo's tragic fall. Before you drift away tonight, gently tap that like button and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy these calming tales. Drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from and the current time. It's always amazing to see our worldwide community. Now, dim those lights, settle comfortably, and let's ease into tonight's story. 2. Life as a nymph, beauty, power, and disposability. Imagine being eternal, tied to the natural world itself, yet never truly remembered. That was life for the nymphs, those minor deities who were synonymous with beauty, grace, and the places they inhabited. They weren't Olympian gods, not bound by the weight of supreme power, but instead were woven into the cracks and blossoms of the earth. Forests had dryads, rivers whispered with naiads, and the mountains, rocky vast and filled with secrets, harbored the Oreads. Nymphs, despite their immortality, were almost inseparably connected to the location they emerged from, as if their beings were stitched to its existence. That tie made them meaningful and expendable, because when someone only sees you as an extension of a place or a fleeting resource, they're not necessarily thinking about who you are. In Greek mythology, nymphs existed as walking metaphors for beauty and power in the natural world. A bubbling stream, strong and free but never distant from the banks that hold it. They were often striking in appearance, which made them coveted by both gods and mortals alike, sometimes to the detriment of their own safety. Zeus, the king of the gods, was particularly notorious for exploiting nymphs, and that wasn't unique to him. Across myths, nymphs found themselves woven into deceptions, distractions, and even punishments, their beauty and eternal youth becoming traps instead of privileges. For instance, the river nymph Callisto, beloved by Zeus, was turned into a bear as punishment by Hera for Zeus's interest in her. Every myth was a reminder. Being desired wasn't the same as being valued. But it wasn't all tragedy from the start. Nymphs were vital pieces of the Greek understanding of nature. Without them, the world lost its breath, its colors. Naiads oversaw rivers and springs, ensuring their waters remained pure and abundant. Dryads protected sacred groves and trees. There are tales of the Greek gods themselves showing deference to these woodland guardians before cutting down a single branch. Then there were the Oreads, like Echo, the mountain dwellers. Picture this: crisp air so thin it almost whistles between the peaks, boulders underfoot as steady and ageless as time itself. That was where Echo thrived, high above the chaos of human settlements, nestled amidst alpine frames crafted by the gods themselves. But no amount of natural beauty could shield her from human-like suffering. For all their immortality and divine connections, nymphs had a precarious existence. At first glance, they seem powerful. Who wouldn't consider being ageless and carved by nature itself a kind of blessing? Yet power, real power, includes agency. Nymphs had little of that compared to the Olympians, who treated them less like fellow deities and more as tools, or worse, playthings. Their lives often intersected catastrophically with the whims of gods, particularly Zeus, from using their charms as pawns in deception to shifting blame for his own transgressions. Zeus was fond of thrusting nymphs into the center of his many, let's call them, situations. Gods who got too close to his antics, like Hera, would often target the nymphs involved instead of Zeus himself. And Hera's wrath. Let's just say it didn't settle quietly into the background. Echo's story begins within this fragile intersection. The fragile safety nymphs could claim, forever dependent on their ability to stay small, unnoticed. To exist for someone else's agenda was to avoid being stripped of your purpose entirely. But Echo wasn't one to blend in, and her ability to stand out would become both her greatest strength and her undoing. Unlike other nymphs who were described primarily by their physical forms, Echo loved language. Her greatest joy was her voice and the stories it allowed her to share. Words, to her, were an art form, not just a way to occupy space, but to define it, color it, reshape it. Maybe it was her way of resisting that larger narrative of disposability. Speak, and you make yourself unforgettable. At least, that's how it should have worked. The Oreads, the mountain nymphs like Echo, were often described as wild yet steadfast. They were guardians of rugged terrains, their presence tied to the fierce, almost intimidating stability of mountains. Think about standing at the base of a massive crag, its height cutting into the sky. It doesn't move, doesn't crumble at your presence. That's the kind of unyielding force Echo should have embodied. But life among the gods required more than the silent strength of rock. It demanded adaptability, the ability to weave yourself into situations as seamlessly as a shadow. For all her unique gifts, Echo's wit and voice made her more noticeable in ways that didn't always serve her. She wasn't meant to play an exaggerated role as some silent guardian of the cliffs. She spoke too much. When it comes to nymphs, there's always that tension between their closeness to divine immortality and their vulnerability to human-like suffering. Echo's story was no exception. Like so many nymphs before her, her qualities were a double-edged sword. And yet, there was something about Echo that made her distinct. She wasn't just used by the gods. She was brought into their inner workings, even valued in her way. But as we'll see, closeness to power doesn't guarantee safety. It usually guarantees the opposite. Echo, for all her brightness, was about to find out what it really meant to be disposable. But what made her so different from the rest? 3. Echo, the chatterbox with a purpose. What if a voice could stop time, hold attention, even sway the gods themselves? Echo's voice wasn't just a tool for conversation, it was her essence. Unlike many nymphs, who were celebrated mostly for their beauty or their connection to nature, Echo stood out because she loved to talk. Not idle, empty chatter to fill silence, but the kind of words that held weight. She was the nymph who could shape an entire mood just by speaking. In a world where most of her kind remained silent guardians of nature, Echo became something different. A nymph with the energy and sharpness of language as her claim to fame. Her talent for storytelling and conversation didn't go unnoticed. Zeus himself took an interest in her. Not romantically, which, let's be honest, was his usual approach when nymphs were involved, but for the unique skill she brought to the table. For Zeus, whose divine exploits often required a fair degree of maneuvering, and by maneuvering, I mean blatant mischief, Echo was an asset. Her fast-talking ways weren't just entertaining, they had utility. Imagine trying to explain yourself to Hera, Zeus's wife and the goddess of marriage, who was perpetually on the lookout for her husband's latest betrayal. You'd need more than charm or convincing arguments. You'd need a distraction. You'd need someone like Echo. But let's rewind for a moment. Why Zeus? Of all the gods, why did the king of Olympus seek out Echo's help? Well, Zeus was infamous for, shall we say, his inability to remain faithful. When you're the king of the gods, no one's going to scold you. But Hera, with her sharp eyes and sharper temper, wasn't the type to let unfaithfulness slide. Zeus always needed an accomplice, someone to keep Hera occupied while he carried out his affairs without being caught, and Echo was a perfect choice. She could captivate anyone with her words, engaging them in conversations that seemed to stretch on effortlessly. Zeus wasn't looking for charm alone. He needed endurance, the ability to outlast Hera in a verbal game of cat and mouse. Echo was a natural. Her role was clear. When Hera grew suspicious and came snooping, Echo would step in. Her job was to distract the goddess without revealing anything, just pull her attention away for as long as it took. She'd pile on compliments, weave long and winding tales, and keep the queen of the gods engaged in conversation so that Zeus could cover his tracks. Imagine Hera nearing a clearing, eyes narrowed and certain she'd find Zeus caught in the act. And then there's Echo, smiling softly, meeting Hera's gaze before launching into a story about the endless beauty of the mountains or the strange birds she'd spied circling higher peaks. It wasn't just about keeping Hera talking, it was about making her believe, even briefly, that nothing was amiss. And every minute Echo spoke was another minute Zeus could escape Hera's wrath. Now, you might be thinking that Echo was stepping way over some invisible line, meddling in the dangerous games of the gods. And you'd be right. Hera wasn't exactly the forgiving type, and getting involved in her marital disputes, even indirectly, was asking for trouble. But for Echo, her ability to help Zeus seemed less like meddling and more like a reflection of her place in the world of mythology. In ancient Greece, storytelling wasn't just entertainment. Stories carried meaning, preserved histories, explained the mysteries of life and the gods. To captivate someone with speech, to hold their attention, was one of the most powerful acts a person or a nymph could perform. Echo's gift wasn't some ornamental talent. It was as vital as the water a naiad might protect or the trees cherished by dryads. Her words didn't just fill silence. They reflected an ability to command attention. In a world shaped by stories, she understood the power she held. Of course, Zeus wasn't interested in the cultural richness of Echo's storytelling. For him, her talent was simply a means to an end. And Echo, like so many nymphs in Greek mythology, wasn't really in a position to say no. Despite the impact her words had, power in the hierarchy of the gods still belonged to those seated on Olympus. No one refused Zeus. Not even the keenest storyteller living on the mountainsides. That's the thing about stories. They can make you memorable, even exceptional, but they don't always shield you from consequences when you're playing in the world of gods. In a way, Echo's assignment suited her nature. She truly did love talking. Conversations brought her joy, and Hera wasn't the kind of goddess you would dismiss as a boring companion. Engaging Hera required more than a pretty voice. Echo had to be quick, perceptive, and sharp, especially when the goddess wasn't exactly the trusting type. Imagine trying to deflect the suspicions of someone who already knows, deep down, that she's being lied to. Every time Echo managed to hold Hera's curiosity without letting her see through the ruse was a small triumph of wit and skill, even if it was all for someone else's benefit. It's possible to imagine Echo taking some pride in the role. Ancient Greek culture revered storytelling, and the experience of captivating even a goddess must have been exhilarating. Echo could spin threads using only her voice, threading tales so intricate that Hera, normally so focused, would forget herself for a moment or two. These weren't ordinary distractions. They were verbal duels, ones in which Echo briefly held the upper hand. Yet the very thing that made her exceptional, her voice, her words, was also what made her vulnerable. The gods might have marveled at her abilities, but they also viewed them, like any other divine gift, as something to be used. It was a transactional relationship. Zeus gained the cover he needed while Echo exercised her gifts on command. There were no equal partnerships in Olympus. You might wonder if Echo ever thought about stepping back, about refusing to play a part in Zeus's schemes. But Echo's reality wasn't one of choices. She had what the gods wanted, and the Olympians didn't ask. They commandeered. For immortals like Echo, proximity to power often came at a cost, and she was now teetering closer to a line with consequences she couldn't yet imagine. What made her unique, what gave her purpose, also put a target on her back. Endearing Hera to her conversation might have been manageable, but distracting the Queen of the Gods repeatedly, day after day, that wasn't a path anyone could walk without missteps eventually catching up. Hera, to her credit, wasn't a fool. She wasn't distracted easily or for long without realizing why. Though Echo earned her moments of trust with each conversation, Hera could always feel the gaps, the strange coincidences, the way Zeus always seemed to be just out of sight. And Echo? Well, her words were quick and skilled, but Hera's anger was sharp, simmering beneath the surface every time her suspicions returned. It was never a question of if Hera would figure it out, only when. What Echo couldn't have known was just how high the price of her clever mouth and good intentions would be. Because once Hera saw through the ruse, her wrath would come down entirely on Echo. Not Zeus. Not the god who orchestrated all this, who asked for Echo's help and knowingly dragged her into his games. No, Hera would deal with Echo directly. Still, for a while, Echo continued, unaware of what was waiting just ahead. To Zeus, her role was just another part in his eternal parade of schemes. To Hera, she became a tool she hadn't yet broken. And to herself. Echo might have been proud, not realizing that the very skill she loved about herself, the one thing that truly set her apart, would soon become the source of her undoing. Imagine the tension, the undercurrent of danger in each passing conversation. How many times did Echo wonder if Hera could sense the truth, lingering underneath her carefully chosen words? Day after day she played the part, not knowing how close she was to crossing a line that couldn't be undone. But Hera wasn't the type to let deception go unpunished, for the wrath of Hera, a curse that stole everything, what happens when the Queen of the Gods decides you've crossed the line. Hera wasn't just any goddess. She was Zeus's wife. And if that title sounds less like a privilege and more like a burden, you're already onto something. As the goddess of marriage and family, Hera's identity was deeply tied to loyalty, fidelity, and all those ideals Zeus seemed to personally enjoy smashing on a daily basis. His escapades were legendary, but those escapades didn't happen in a vacuum. Someone always got caught up in them, and more often than not, those someones were women, mortals, and nymphs like Echo. Hera's fury was rarely directed at Zeus himself. Years of betrayal might have dulled her hope of keeping him faithful, but they hadn't dulled her anger. When Zeus stepped out of line, Hera didn't wage war on him. Instead, she turned her gaze on whomever had dared to get involved or helped him. For Echo, her role in distracting the Queen of the Gods wasn't an accident. Hera always suspected when Zeus was up to something, which, let's be real, was almost all the time. And although Zeus thought he'd been clever by using Echo as a distraction, Hera's cleverness had its limits, and those limits were about to snap. Now, you can imagine how this probably went down. Hera shows up, already suspicious that Zeus is off somewhere he shouldn't be, and Echo is waiting in the wings, ready to stall her. Echo's charm worked at first. She'd keep Hera occupied for minutes, maybe even hours, spinning well-crafted tales, asking questions so engaging Hera had no choice but to stay and respond. But Hera wasn't just any goddess. She wasn't fooled forever. It didn't take long before the Queen of Olympus caught on to the pattern. Perhaps it was just a flicker of recognition the first time. Why was this nymph always here? Why was she always so eager to talk? And why, no matter how long she stayed to listen, did she never find Zeus where she expected him? Hera's patience wore thin, and maybe Echo's words, her brilliant, skillful words, started sounding less like stories and more like lies. Suspicion turned to realization. Echo had been planted there, not as a loyal servant of Hera, but as an accomplice in her husband's endless infidelities. There was no explosion of wrath, no screaming match, not yet. Hera wasn't the sort to lash out blindly. She waited, piecing things together. In the end, Echo didn't need to admit anything because Hera already knew. And what a betrayal it must have felt like. She was the goddess of marriage. Echo was a nymph sworn to obey the gods. But instead of upholding Hera's domain, protecting fairness and loyalty, Echo had been playing games for Zeus, actively helping him cover his tracks. Now, here's the thing about Hera. She had a reputation. Her punishments were never light. She carried grudges that could span lifetimes. Look at what she did to Heracles, the literal son of Zeus, punishing him not for what he'd done, but because of the circumstances of his birth. Echo's actions were direct. She didn't just stumble into Hera's world accidentally. She actively worked to undermine her authority. To distract a goddess is one thing. To distract Hera, knowing full well what she was doing, that was something else entirely. And Hera wanted to make a statement. A punishment that wasn't simply about vengeance, but about ensuring that Echo would never have the chance to deceive her, or anyone else, again. So, Hera cursed her. And it wasn't just any curse. It was precise, deliberate, designed to strip Echo of the one thing she cherished most. Her words. Her voice. Hera looked at this nymph, this clever chatterbox who had dared to play games with the gods, and she didn't take away her beauty. She didn't imprison her. She didn't force her into servitude. Instead, Hera silenced her in the cruelest, most calculated way imaginable. Echo could no longer speak her own thoughts. Every story she loved to tell, every clever remark she might have made, all erased. The curse allowed her to speak only by repeating the final words spoken to her. Can you even imagine it? The thing that made her special, her wit and thoughtfulness, reduced to parroting fragments of other people's words. Hera hadn't just taken Echo's voice, she'd taken her identity. Her voice had been an extension of her soul, the one thing that set her apart from the countless other nymphs wandering the natural world. Without it, what was she? Just another pretty face, another forgotten spirit of the mountains, reduced, literally, to an echo. The symbolism of Hera's curse runs deep. In mythology, Hera often played the role of punisher, particularly when it came to those who crossed boundaries in Zeus's many schemes. But Echo's story feels even more devastating because of how personal it was. Unlike others who were turned into animals or struck down immediately, Echo's punishment didn't just end her story. It lingered. It wasn't about killing her or banishing her, but about forcing her to exist in a state of perpetual helplessness. She couldn't explain. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't charm her way out of this one. Every word that came out of her mouth from that moment on belonged to someone else. It's easy to question why Hera targeted Echo so harshly while Zeus, the orchestrator of everything, walked away untouched. Maybe it's because Zeus, as king of the gods, was untouchable by design. Maybe it's because Hera knew hurting Zeus directly didn't stop him. If anything, it encouraged him. Or maybe it was because Hera's anger wasn't just about Echo's deception. It was about what Echo represented. A clever, outspoken woman willing to meddle in affairs she shouldn't have, willing to use intelligence and wit to outmaneuver the Queen of Olympus herself. Hera didn't just want revenge on Echo. She wanted to make sure Echo's voice could never rise above hers or anyone else's again. It's important to remember, too, that this wasn't just a punishment. It was a warning. To others, to nymphs, mortals, maybe even gods who might think they could use cleverness and charm to tip the scales in their favor. In the world of Greek mythology, wisdom and strategy were respected, but wit and defiance, especially from women, had limits. Hera reminded Echo, and everyone, that the gods held all the cards. They didn't mind cleverness, so long as it served them. If it crossed them, no matter how small the offense seemed, the consequences could be final. For Echo, the aftermath of the curse was devastating. Imagine how isolating it must have been. Conversations, one of her great joys, were now impossible. Relationships, friendships, all faded. People grew frustrated. Who could sit there, endlessly repeated back to, without eventually giving up? She became an outsider, wandering through the mountains, still there but barely noticed, barely present. She might have still laughed at a joke, admired the places she once loved, but that laughter, those thoughts, none of them made it past her lips anymore. Hera hadn't just silenced her, she'd erased the core of what made Echo herself. It's hard to imagine that level of isolation. Keep in mind, Echo wasn't a mortal who could simply fade into obscurity and pass on. She was a nymph, immortal, unable to escape her curse, forced to navigate eternity with nothing but fragments of other people's words. With her voice stolen, Echo wandered the world, searching perhaps for meaning, perhaps for companionship. But it was clear that fate wasn't done with her yet. 5. A chance meeting with Narcissus, the forest, was still that day, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel heavier, like the world itself is waiting. Shadows stretched long between the trees, while the only sounds came from whispering leaves and far-off streams. It was the kind of silence Echo had grown used to, the kind that would never answer her. This was her home now, the wild stretching across the mountains she once protected. But what good was a home when she was nothing more than a hushed presence within it? Nothing more than someone who could only mimic the words of others, trapped inside herself. That quiet was all she had left, until she saw him. Narcissus. The name alone carried a weight most mortals couldn't dream of. He wasn't just handsome. He was the kind of beautiful that turned heads and stopped hearts. His beauty was effortless, almost cruel, so perfect it seemed untouched by the world. Narcissus was a mortal hunter, famously agile and sharp, but it wasn't his talent that captured the attention of gods and men alike. It was his face, his form, his entire being, so striking that people swore he must have been sculpted by the gods themselves. But there was a catch, wasn't there always? Narcissus wasn't known for his kindness or humility. His vanity was a trap he'd never escape, though he couldn't see it yet. Echo saw him before he saw her. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was fate, but her eyes found him, standing near the edge of a glade. He leaned against a tree. Sunlight glanced across his shoulders, catching the angles of his face, as if the forest itself wanted to admire him. And for Echo, who had been alone in her curse for so long, it was as if a door she thought had been locked forever suddenly cracked open. How she longed to speak to him, to tell him what she saw, what she felt. But Hera had ensured that any words Echo spoke would never be her own. So there it was, her curse had trapped her again. She could speak to this striking, impossible hunter, but what could she truly say? How could she ever make him see her when all her words belonged to him, just bouncing back like some pale imitation of conversation? It was cruel, wasn't it, to finally feel something? Hope, desire, connection, only to be unable to give it voice. Her silence had never felt heavier, and yet she stayed hidden, waiting for a moment when she might try. Narcissus, of course, was oblivious to his watcher. He wasn't looking for anyone. He wasn't waiting for some grand connection or star-crossed meeting in the stillness of the woods. That wasn't who he was. Narcissus existed in his own world, a place where reflections mattered more than relationships, where admiration was easier to accept than love. Still, he moved gracefully between the trees, his shadow long and unbroken, calling out as a hunter might. "Is anyone there?" And just like that, Echo's chest tightened painfully. "Is anyone there?" The words reached her, and before she could stop herself, her voice followed helplessly, repeating his question just as the curse demanded. "Here," she heard herself say. That same beautiful voice that once captivated gods now betrayed her, echoing back to him with no thought of her own. Narcissus froze at the sound, curiosity flickering across his features. "Here!" Her voice rang again, almost too eager. It wasn't hers. It could never be hers. Looking around sharply, he spoke again, his own words deliberate and wary. "Come to me," he said, his tone almost commanding, as if expecting some hidden being in the trees to obey. How could he know she was there, so close her heart might have leapt from her chest? But his demand felt like a gift, a chance, an opening she hadn't dared hope for. "Come to me," she repeated, her voice breathless, brimming with longing he couldn't hear. She stepped closer, her footfalls light against the earth, heart racing faster than it had in centuries. But Narcissus wasn't seeing her. Those perfect features of his didn't light with recognition or soften into warmth. Instead, he frowned, puzzling over the disembodied repetition of his own words. "Why do you run from me?" he asked the silence, a question whispered more out of suspicion than any genuine curiosity. Her response tumbled back to him unbidden, trembling with a desperate energy. "Why do you run from me?" Her hands trembled at her sides as she stood unseen between the trees, waiting for something, anything that could carry her past the barrier of her curse. His suspicion faded, and for a moment he softened, his voice less harsh now. "Let us meet together," he finally said, reaching one hand absently toward the space where her voice seemed to drift. Echo's nerves surged, her repetition bursting from her lips. Together. It was the closest thing to an invitation she could imagine. She stepped from the shadows into the light, her presence now undeniable. She hurried toward him, desperate to close the space between them, desperate for him to see her fully. But hope isn't always kind. Narcissus didn't see her as she had imagined, didn't hear her exclamation as anything more than a strange mimicry of his own. He recoiled as her outstretched hand moved toward him, his face twisting with disgust. "Hands off!" he spat, his voice cold and cutting. He stepped back, staring at her as though she were a trick of the forest, not a living, breathing being. "May I die before you enjoy my body," he snapped finally, the words biting and final. Echo's own curse betrayed her again, forcing her to repeat the last fragment of his humiliation. "Enjoy my body." Her voice cracked, thin and broken under the weight of rejection. And just like that, Narcissus turned from her, his interest already lost, his focus drifting somewhere far away from the heart he had just shattered. She stood there, silent now, except for the echoes lingering like ghosts in the trees. The hand she had reached out with fell limply to her side, and she watched him walk away, his stride steady, his head unturned. It wasn't just rejection, it was obliteration. Narcissus hadn't only left her. He had taken the fragile strand of hope she carried and severed it. Echo may have been immortal, but that didn't mean she couldn't feel pain, and this pain was immense. It swallowed her, filling the woods around her with a sorrow so profound it almost seemed to seep into the trees themselves. Rejected by the one she had loved, silenced forever by the wrath of a goddess, Echo had nothing left. As the light shifted and faded, she withdrew, her form retreating deeper into the rocky folds of the mountains she once called home. Her isolation stretched farther, her voice growing quieter with every passing day. And yet, Narcissus continued forward, unaware, or perhaps uncaring of what he had left behind. Their brief, unbalanced meeting was nothing more than a passing moment to him. But for Echo, it was everything. It was the moment her own curse stopped being theoretical and became heartbreakingly tangible, but Narcissus's fate was about to take a tragic turn of its own. 6. The hunter who fell for his own reflection, Narcissus crouched by the pool of water, the tips of his fingers brushing past the surface but not breaking it. He wasn't thirsty. Not anymore. Along the edges of the pool were tufts of grass, bent from his weight where he had knelt for hours, maybe days. Time didn't seem to matter to him as much as the figure gazing back from the water. The reflection wasn't just something he admired, it had become everything, his whole world. Here was Narcissus, hunter of forests, breaker of hearts brought to a standstill by nothing more than his own image. But this wasn't just an accident, some mortal wandering too long in the woods. No, this was a curse, and it was one he'd earned. Narcissus wasn't simply beautiful. He was arrogant, untouchable, almost icy in his refusal to care for anyone beyond himself. He rejected love like it was beneath him, like those who adored him didn't deserve even a second glance. When he left Echo battered by rejection, humiliated in the forest, perhaps he thought nothing of it at all. Maybe he didn't even notice the way her voice, diminished but haunting, lingered long after he had gone. And then Nemesis took notice. Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, didn't often meddle. But when she did, it was swift and unrelenting, always poetic in its punishment. For Narcissus, she knew the perfect revenge. Echo's love for him had been unreturned, her longing denied. That same pain, Nemesis decided, would be his undoing. She cursed him with a love as impossible as Echo's had been. But instead of longing for someone else, Narcissus would fall for the one thing he valued most, his own reflection, an unrequited love that could never give back. Just like Echo. You might imagine Nemesis setting up the scene, the perfect trap with an almost cruel precision. The pool was shallow and clear, hidden deep within the woods where silence pressed heavy. The water was so still, it became a flawless mirror. A moment alone. That's all it took. Narcissus knelt there, and when he leaned over to peer into the water, the sight froze him. Even for someone as self-assured as Narcissus, this reflection was striking. It had to be another person, didn't it? Surely someone this beautiful couldn't just be an image. He leaned closer. "Who are you?" It was a whisper, soft and almost trembling, but there was no answer. The figure in the water moved exactly as he did, their hand lifting to meet his on the glistening surface. The more he looked, the harder it became to turn away. His heart, the one that had never softened for anyone else, now raced. The irony wasn't lost on the gods watching. Here was Narcissus, who had brushed aside so many admirers without a care, now caught in his own web of desire. He stayed by the water, his body frozen and bent over the reflection, completely consumed. The tragedy, of course, was that there was no true connection there. The figure in the pool couldn't reach out. It couldn't speak back or hold him or offer anything beyond its perpetual mimicry of his own movements. What Narcissus believed to be love was nothing more than his own obsession, a cycle of longing with no end. The forest stood a silent witness to his unraveling. Days passed, the shadows of the trees stretching and retreating as the sun rose and fell. His hands, once so steady with a hunter's bow, had become unsteady, shaking as he reached endlessly toward the water's surface. He spoke to the reflection, whispering words that grew quieter with time. He praised it, adored it, begged it to stay, and when no answer ever came, not even a ripple on the water, he began to plead. All that aloof confidence, the haughty distance he'd kept from others. It was gone. In its place was someone small and helpless, trapped by desires he couldn't quench. The pool itself seemed unremarkable, just a shallow stretch of water hidden in the woods, but it became a kind of prison. Narcissus couldn't leave. There was no world beyond the shimmering face in front of him. And maybe that was the point. The gods didn't need to build walls or lock the door. His own obsession was enough to hold him in place. Every time he tried to dip his fingers into the water, tried to touch what wasn't there, the ripples would scatter the image, creating momentary chaos before it returned, perfect as ever. Imagine the torment of that, watching the thing you love shatter over and over again, only to look again the moment it reappears. For Narcissus, it wasn't just vanity. It was isolation. He had shut himself off from the world long before coming to that pool, dismissing every connection offered to him, leaving pain in his wake. Now, there was nothing left but this shallow pool of water, and his own reflection tying him to the earth. The deeper meaning here couldn't be clearer. In Greek mythology, Narcissus became the cautionary tale for self-obsession, a warning about what happens when you refuse to engage with the world beyond yourself. His story wasn't just about beauty. It was about how isolating it could be to place yourself above others, to love nothing but your own image. The tragic brilliance of this curse, though, was how it mirrored Echo. She had wanted nothing more than to be heard, to connect with someone, especially with him. And just as she was left to wander the empty spaces of the mountains, trapped in voiceless repetition, Narcissus was now stuck in a cycle that mirrored that longing. Both of them cursed, both trapped, but in entirely different ways. Nemesis's revenge had made sure of that. In time, Narcissus began to fade. He couldn't pull himself away, couldn't eat or drink. His strength ebbed, and his once proud figure grew weak. The beauty that had captivated others so effortlessly was now wasting away alongside him. But still, his gaze stayed fixed on the water, as if it was the only thing keeping him alive. And perhaps, in some small way, it was. His hunger, his thirst. They didn't matter to him anymore. The reflection was all that mattered. As his body weakened, his voice grew quieter, strained. The praise turned into soft laments, almost mournful as he whispered to the reflection, "Why can't you stay with me?" Maybe in those final moments he realized the impossible nature of his desire. But it was too late. Narcissus, once untouchable, once admired by so many, wasted away, crumpled by the edge of the pool that held him captive. In the aftermath, the gods, ever dramatic, made sure his beauty left its mark on the world. From the spot where Narcissus died, a flower sprouted, white, delicate, its face bending to stare at the water below. The Narcissus flower, becoming both tribute and punishment, forever tied to his name and his story. Even in death, his image lingered, but only as a reminder of his downfall, a fragile emblem of what happens when vanity cuts a person off from the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the forest still carried a different kind of voice. Echo, though diminished, still lingered. Her sound drifted through the mountains and trees, repeating the final words of those who passed through the woods. But she too, much like Narcissus, was fading. Each word she repeated seemed fainter, more stretched, a ghost of herself echoing into nothing. 2 lives. One mortal, one immortal. Both undone by their inability to connect. But while Narcissus's existence was cut short, Echo's curse ensured she would endure, though not as the person she once was. Meanwhile, Echo was also fading, but in a different way. 7. Echo fades away. From a body to a voice heartbroken and humiliated, Echo retreated deep into the mountains, The places that once felt like her domain now became her refuge, the only spots where she could exist without the piercing gaze of gods or mortals. She wandered farther than she ever had before, into the cracks of cliffs and the still shadows that people rarely dared to venture. Isolation had been her companion since Hera's curse, but something about Narcissus's rejection had fractured her completely. It wasn't just unrequited love, it was a reminder that her voice, the one thing she had left, was useless to her now. All her cleverness, all her stories, all the joy she once found in language, it might as well have disappeared the moment Narcissus turned away. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. What was left to sustain her? In the myths, it's said that her physical body began to fade, wasting away with each passing day. The more she wandered, the more insubstantial she became, until the rocks and air seemed more concrete than she was. Her figure grew lighter, less defined, as if the mountains themselves were absorbing her. Her bones turned to stone, merging into the cliffs. Her body, the tangible proof of her existence, vanished entirely. What remained? Her voice, fragile and ghostly, echoing faintly through the wilderness. There's something deeply poetic and deeply tragic about this transformation. Echo's body fading into nothing was a physical representation of what had been happening all along. Her identity had already started to unravel the moment Hera silenced her. The punishment cut away at her individuality, her ability to express herself, and now even her presence in the world was crumbling. To lose yourself piece by piece until there's nothing left but sound. It's hard to imagine a more isolating end. The mountains, those jagged behemoths where she once thrived, became the only part of her she had any connection to now. In Greek mythology, the Oreads, Echo's type of nymph were tied to the mountains, their beings intertwined with that harsh, resilient landscape. It was fitting, in a cruel sense, that Echo's last remnants would cling to the cliffs she had always called home. But instead of protecting or celebrating her, they became the backdrop of her endless despair. Picture those towering peaks, wind rushing through crevices, the silence of valleys broken only by the occasional shift of loose stones. And then, faintly, a voice. Not a full conversation, not words with meaning, but the eerie repetition of someone else's call. "Is anyone there?" They might shout into the expanse. "There, there," her voice would answer, thin and distant, bouncing through the rocks. This was all she became, a mimicry, a faint and fragmented presence. What makes Echo's story particularly haunting is how literal her transformation is. We still use the term echo today, describing the way sound bounces back to us, and it's all tied to the voice she left behind. Think about it. An echo isn't just a sound. It's the reflection of something that's already been spoken. It repeats, but it doesn't create. It doesn't add anything new. It doesn't change or challenge or express emotion. It's hollow, incomplete, robbed of intention. And that was what Echo became. A voice without meaning, existence without identity. The curse Hera struck her with had fully consumed her, leaving her with nothing of her former self except a haunting trace that could never grow beyond what someone else offered her. Yet, even as her body disappeared, her voice endured. According to the myths, even as her bones turned to stone, her voice continued to float across the wilderness. It was a cruel kind of immortality. Hera's punishment had taken away the joy of her eternal life, replacing it with an existence that was smaller and lonelier with each passing day. Immortality might sound like a blessing, but for Echo, it was a sentence of never truly fading, never being free. She wasn't living, but she wasn't gone either. The worst kind of purgatory. Ancient Greeks might have seen her fate as a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when you challenge the gods or speak too freely. But layered beneath that is something even more timeless, the idea of silencing voices as a form of power. Hera didn't just punish Echo for helping Zeus. She stripped her of her ability to define herself, and in doing so, her punishment ensured that Echo could never be more than what others made of her. She became the embodiment of repetition, the absence of originality, trapped forever in the edges of other people's worlds. One of the most fascinating things about Echo's story is how closely tied it is to the natural world. The concept of an echo, a sound bouncing off surfaces and returning, is something deeply rooted in our environment. Think of standing in a canyon, shouting into the void and hearing your words return. Nearly every culture throughout history has a word for this phenomenon. But in Greek mythology, the echo wasn't just about sound physics. It was a living story, one that carried meaning and emotion long after the actual person faded away. Ovid's version of the myth spells this out explicitly. Even after her physical form was no longer there, her voice lived on in the wilderness. Her voice wasn't hers anymore, but it didn't vanish entirely. It stayed with the stones and valleys, immortal in its repetition. This idea of something lingering, a sound, a voice, a fragment of a person, feels oddly universal. How often do people feel like they're not really seen or heard, like their existence is reduced to something small and unrecognizable? Echo's curse, though tied to divine whims, speaks to that same fear. To be there, but not whole. To speak, but not create connection. To fade, but never truly disappear. It's both beautiful and devastating, isn't it? Echo's voice became part of the landscape she called home, a reminder of her presence even while her identity faded into nothing. It was poetic justice in the most painful form. Hera's curse ensured that Echo's voice would survive, but only as a powerless fragment of what it once was. Anyone who crossed through the mountains might hear her, but no one would ever understand her. She wasn't speaking. She was just replying. Forever. But there's another way to view it. The mountains could also be seen as a kind of sanctuary, not just a prison. The way her voice clung to the cliffs and valleys could mean that Echo never truly left her world behind. The landscape protected that last fragile piece of her, carrying it forward through time even when everything else had disappeared. In that sense, her voice wasn't entirely powerless. It lingered, unbroken. It still caught the ear of wanderers, still added a faint kind of life to places that might otherwise feel utterly empty. Maybe there's comfort in that, even if it's not the life she once had. In the end, Echo became more than her own story. Her name, her existence, her curse. It all became part of the human experience, woven into the ways we think about sound, communication, and even loneliness. Her voice, faint and fragmented, became the symbol of unrequited longing, of words that couldn't bridge the distance between people. And it's still haunting. Even now, when you hear an echo in the mountains, or between the stone walls of a canyon, you're hearing the legacy of the story. That sound is hers, still there after all this time, tied to the cliffs she called home. But Echo's story doesn't just end with her fading away. 8. A symbol of silenced women. What does it mean to lose your voice in a world where power thrives on controlling it? Echo's curse wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. When Hera silenced her, turning her from a vibrant storyteller into a mere shadow, it wasn't just punishment for helping Zeus. It was a reflection of something broader, something we see again and again in Greek mythology, women being silenced, punished or erased when they spoke too freely or stepped beyond their expected roles. Think about how Hera struck her down. Hera didn't kill Echo. She didn't strip her of her beauty or her immortality. Instead, she took away something much more defining, her ability to express herself. That wasn't a random choice. Hera's curse was calculated to eliminate Echo's agency completely, leaving her powerless in the one way that mattered most to her. In taking away her voice, Hera condemned Echo to exist as only a fragment of herself, a presence that others could hear but never truly engage with. Her thoughts, her feelings, all gone. She didn't just lose her voice, she lost her identity. This isn't something exclusive to Echo's story. In Greek mythology, women often paid the price for speaking when they shouldn't, or for standing out in ways that disrupted the godly status quo. Take Cassandra, for example, gifted with the power of prophecy by Apollo, but cursed so that no one would ever believe her. Or Arachne, whose skill in weaving challenged Athena's pride. She was transformed into a spider, forever spinning webs, forever silenced. There's a pattern here. Women who dared to show intelligence, wit, or talent, especially if it crossed paths with male gods, found themselves punished, not for their abilities, but for daring to use them. Hera's actions toward Echo follow this same disturbing thread. But Echo's situation highlights something even more specific, the double standards woven into the myths. Zeus, the instigator of the whole issue, faces no consequences, not a single one. He uses Echo, relies on her gift to distract Hera, and then walks away untouched while Hera's wrath rains down solely on the nymph. It's a theme we see repeatedly in mythology, men causing the chaos and women bearing the brunt of the punishment. Hera's anger at Zeus is channeled onto Echo, even though it's Zeus who deserved the blame. You might think, wait, why doesn't Zeus get targeted? And isn't that the point? Hera's curse serves not just as a punishment for Echo, but as a brutal reminder of how the power dynamics in these stories work. Zeus didn't need to worry about the consequences of his actions. Echo, on the other hand, had everything to lose, and yet the punishment wasn't just about blame. It was about control. Silencing Echo wasn't just a way to make her suffer. It was a way to ensure she couldn't speak up, couldn't use her wit or charm to influence anyone again. In doing so, Hera made Echo powerless in the most profound way. Her curse meant Echo could never be a protagonist in her own story again. She could only exist as a reflection of others. Think about that for a second. Her voice, once vibrant and full of meaning, was reduced to repetition, a hollow extension of anyone who happened to speak near her. "Let us meet together," Narcissus said, and Echo could only plead back, "Together." Her words, stripped of intent, became nothing more than echoes of someone else's. She was left without a language of her own. Now, if this feels familiar, it's probably because this problem isn't stuck in ancient mythology. The idea of silencing women who challenge authority is one that echoes, no pun intended, across history. For centuries, women's voices have been controlled, suppressed, mocked, or ignored when they didn't fit neatly into societal expectations. In medieval times, women accused of being too talkative were forced to wear devices like the scold's bridle, a metal contraption meant to humiliate and physically silence them. Ancient Roman and Greek texts celebrated women who were quiet or moderate in speech, while outspoken women were labeled as unnatural or dangerous. Even as recently as the modern era, figures fighting for women's rights, such as suffragettes, were dismissed or ridiculed simply for demanding a voice in politics. Echo's story, while exaggerated through its mythic lens, reflects a truth that transcends time. When someone's voice holds power, taking that voice away is one of the easiest ways to control them. In Echo's case, her punishment wasn't just personal. It embodies the broader cultural suppression of female agency and expression. Hera removed the one thing that made Echo stand out in the first place, forcing her back into the shadows. And this wasn't just mythology reflecting societal values, it also shaped them. Stories like Echo's didn't just entertain. It reinforced the idea of what happened when women challenged authority, dared to take up space, or used their gifts in ways that threatened the world around them. Her curse acted as a warning. Stay quiet. Don't stand out. Don't speak unless spoken to. And then think about the irony here. It's brutal. The thing that made Echo so special. Her voice wasn't just taken from her, it was weaponized against her. Zeus saw Echo's chatter as useful. Her gift was something he could exploit to protect himself. But when Hera imposed the curse, she flipped that gift into a punishment, turning Echo's quick wit into a lesson about the dangers of standing at the intersection of power and obedience. The tragedy is layered. Echo couldn't win. Her cleverness gave her purpose, but in the end, it also gave her a curse she couldn't escape. In academic interpretations of the myth, Hera's curse is often viewed as a kind of erasure. By removing Echo's ability to speak for herself, Hera removed Echo's agency entirely. All Echo could do was reflect back what others said, mirroring the world around her without contributing to it. This transformation from a nymph to a literal Echo highlights something chilling. In a patriarchal framework, a woman who is silenced is often viewed as less of a threat. Her opinions can't cause disruptions. Her thoughts can't challenge authority. She becomes invisible, except for the fragments others use her to repeat. Modern parallels to Echo's curse are everywhere if you look for them. Women's expressions are still policed, although the methods may not come with divine interventions. Speaking too loudly, too passionately, or too intensely still draws criticism today. You hear it in debates about how women should behave in the public sphere. A woman acting assertive is bossy, while the same behavior in a man is seen as leadership. You see it in workplaces where women's ideas get ignored until someone else repeats them and claims the credit Echo's curse in a modern meeting room. You read it in stories of women fighting for their right to education, their right to vote, their right to speak, and being silenced by laws, intimidation, or violence. But here's where Echo's story becomes particularly powerful. Her voice, though cursed, survived. She endured in the literal echoes that reverberate through mountains, valleys, and canyons, lingering long after her body had faded away. She may have been silenced by Hera, ignored by Narcissus, and reduced to the fragments of other people's words. And yet, the sound of her existence remained. Even in the shadow of her punishment, Echo persisted. There's something haunting but also inspiring about that. Even when the gods tried to erase her, she became part of the world itself, bound to its landscapes, impossible to truly silence. And maybe that's why Echo's story feels as relevant now as it did thousands of years ago. Beyond the tragedy and the cruelty, there's a strange kind of defiance in the way her voice lives on. Today, we fight to amplify voices that have been pushed aside, to hear the echoes of our world and give them space to speak. Her tale reminds us why it matters, why silencing someone can never truly erase their impact, and why every voice, no matter how faint, carries meaning. The sound of Echo's voice in the mountains isn't just a repetition, it's a reminder. A reminder of what happens when power is used to suppress instead of uplift. A reminder of the resilience of voices, even under the weight of oppression. And a reminder that her story, thousands of years old, is still speaking to us now. Yet, even as a mere echo, her story endures. 9. Why Echo still matters today so? How does a story about a cursed voice and a self-obsessed hunter still hold its weight in the modern world? Echo's tale might seem like it's trapped in the marble columns and misty mountains of ancient Greece. But if you take a closer look, her story resonates far beyond its mythological roots. What makes it so enduring? It's the way her transformation hits something deeply human: isolation, longing, the aching need to be understood, and the cruel barrier of being unheard. These aren't just old ideas, they're emotions we still wrestle with today. And Echo? She embodies them so perfectly that her voice never really stopped echoing. Her fate as a nymph, reduced to nothing but sound, captures one of the most profound kinds of loneliness. Imagine longing to express yourself, to articulate your deepest emotions, only to be trapped in a cycle of repetition where none of the words are your own. Echo became a metaphor not just for unrequited love, but for the very idea of having your voice stripped away. Speak, but never for yourself, Hera's curse might as well have said. This idea of being stuck on the edges of the conversation, of only reflecting what others project, feels timeless because we've all experienced it, in small ways or big, wanting to be heard but failing to connect, feeling like no one truly understands you. That's not just myth, that's life. It's no wonder then that Echo's story has rippled through centuries of art, literature, and even modern storytelling. Her sorrow and silence are deeply relatable. Take John William Waterhouse's painting, Echo and Narcissus, created in 1903. If you've never seen it, it's worth looking up. The scene captures that central, tragic moment in their myth. In the foreground, Echo sits on the grass, gazing quietly at Narcissus as he leans toward his reflection in a still pool. The emotional distance between them is palpable. Her yearning gaze, his utter self-absorption. She's there, fully present and aching, but completely unseen by him. Waterhouse painted not just a moment, but an entire relationship dynamic, the one who gives and the one who cannot receive. It puts their story into a single moment that feels almost unbearably intimate, despite its quiet sadness. But paintings aren't the only place Echo lives on. Literature has embraced her as well, pulling her myth into new narratives and perspectives. Rick Riordan's 2012 book, The Mark of Athena, for example, breathes fresh life into her story, keeping her curse intact. In Riordan's version, Echo's predicament becomes a way to explore the struggles of communication and identity, especially for characters navigating complex relationships and challenges. Sound familiar? That's part of what makes her myth so enduring. It's elastic. You can stretch it across different ages and settings, and it still holds together. Her loss of voice doesn't just belong to the gods, it resonates in any story about agency, expression, and the human need to connect. What really makes Echo's tale feel universal, even today, are the themes that pulse beneath its surface. Think about unrequited love, for starters. The pain of longing for someone who doesn't return your feelings, or worse, doesn't even notice your existence, is an emotion as old as time. It's a pang of the heart that spans cultures and eras. Echo didn't just love Narcissus, she poured herself into him, even when all she could offer him were broken words. And his rejection of her wasn't just a refusal of her affection, it was a dismissal of her entire being. That kind of sorrow feels raw no matter when or where the story is told. Then there's the theme of losing your voice, both literally and metaphorically. Echo's curse isn't just about repeated phrases, it's about the horror of losing control over how you're seen and understood. Every time she spoke after Hera's curse, her words belonged to someone else. She didn't get to explain herself, contribute to dialogue, or speak her truth. And while her literal echo in the mountains is steeped in mythology, the feeling behind it actually hits home in modern times. Throughout history, marginalized groups have often been denied their voices, their ability to tell their own stories. Echo's loss feels like a stand-in for that very real struggle. The sense of being erased while still existing, of being just present enough to know you're unseen. Even modern society is full of metaphorical echoes, especially in a world where communication is louder than ever, but not always more meaningful. Social media, for example, often creates spaces where people's opinions are drowned out by noise, or where the same shallow ideas are repeated over and over without depth. Echo's repetition mirrors this frustrating reality, where voices sometimes feel flattened to a whisper in an overcrowded room. And at the same time, doesn't Narcissus translate perfectly to our current age? Self-obsession, the obsession with image. Narcissus staring into the water really isn't so different from someone scrolling endlessly through selfies, hooked on the validation of their own reflection. The myth of Echo and Narcissus doesn't just tackle emotional struggles, though. It digs into big questions about identity and impermanence. Think about Echo herself. She started out as someone full of life and personality, a nymph who lived for storytelling and connection. But by the end of her story, her transformation into a literal echo leaves her as something fleeting, intangible. She's still there, but she's not. There's nothing solid left of her except a faint sound on the air. It's a haunting image that forces you to think about what really makes a person, what defines us when everything else is stripped away. And yet, despite her tragic fate, Echo as a concept endures. That's the twist, isn't it? The story is about her being silenced and erased, but at the same time, her voice becomes immortal. It's bound to the mountains, the valleys, the spaces where the natural world carries sound. There's something almost defiant about the fact that, even though Hera cursed her to repeat others, she's still heard. When someone calls out in a canyon and hears their voice bounce back, that's echo. It proves that even the faintest voices, the most overshadowed people, can leave something lasting in the world. Her story also encourages reflection on the importance of self-expression, and how terrifying it is to lose it. Echo couldn't communicate the kind of love and depth she felt, not to Narcissus, not to anyone else. Her inability to define herself through her own words parallels very real struggles that people face today. Whether it's due to systemic oppression, societal barriers, or personal challenges, losing your voice, or having it ignored, is devastating. Echo's story reminds us how much agency and identity are tied to expression, and what we lose when it's taken from us. Over the centuries, artists and storytellers have kept Echo's myth alive because it doesn't just belong to the past, it grows with the world. Her name might be tied to ancient Greek mythology, but her story reflects human emotions and struggles that are as present now as they were back then. Lost love, silenced voices, a desperate need to connect. These are themes that refuse to fade. As long as people feel unheard, as long as they wrestle with longing and isolation, Echo will matter. And yet, there's also something aspirational about her tale. Even though she lost her identity, her voice remains. Sure, it's faint, fragmented, and not entirely hers anymore, but it's there. It lingers. That persistence feels like a quiet rebellion against the hopelessness of her curse. Maybe that's why Echo's myth endures, not just because of the sadness woven into it, but the idea that even in the face of incredible loss, something remains. Her story, her voice, survives. And in a way, it does exactly what Echo herself wanted to be heard, even if it's just a soft sound in the distance. And so, her voice lingers, reminding us of truths we cannot ignore. Echo's story reminds us of a simple truth: even a faint voice can carry profound meaning. Her voice, stripped of intention and identity, still resonates through time, not as her own, but as a symbol of how silencing someone doesn't erase their presence. If her voice could endure for millennia, think about this. How will you use yours? Whether it's sharing your truth, creating art, or simply connecting with others, your voice matters. So, speak it while you have it. And as you settle into sleep tonight, let her story echo softly in your thoughts, a whisper that refuses to fade away.